Okay. So I started off with talking about anomie as a concept of which is the word means lawlessness, but it would be more correct to talk about the sense of meaninglessness, which undermines norms, values, and laws. And these are high levels in Russia and Ukraine, but there are two different responses. In Russia, it has been responses of authoritarianism, an extreme focus on absent authorities, not the local mayor. They don't care about local mayor. It's the president, it's the patriarch, very absent, far distant authorities are more important than local politicians and other important people in your... Now, is better? Yeah. So important people in the local neighbor is not as important as absent authorities. And I showed you also that the troika that is very important in Russia even today. The president, the patriarch, and the church. They are the three major authorities that are very popular in Russia today. And I mentioned also that 4.8% goes to church regularly in Russia today, which means but 73% of the Russians, they believe that the church is very important for their nation. So you see the contrast between practice and theory here. Then I try to introduce the idea that when the Russian society has a long history, together with Ukraine of course, of working for the complete mediation between theory and practice. What I call absolute enlightenment, because I want to distinguish it from the ideology, but the practice of mediating between theory and practice has been very strong since Peter the Great. And there has not been any real effort to counteract that. So instead, this is continuous red thread through the history both in Ukraine and in Russia. Of course, there are individuals that think differently. There's always that in a society. But in general, this has been the guiding line, both through the Soviet Union, through the Tsar kingdom, but it also prevails now, especially in the churches. And we can see the signs in the Russian Orthodox Church with the development of a Ruski Mir. I wouldn't say idea, it's not an ideology, it's a vision and obscure idea, so to say, which is based on this idea that you have to have a perfect society. This high level of anomie is not a new phenomenon in history. The only thing is that we have just recently discovered how to measure it. So we don't have the measurements prior to 1990. So it's a very new way of understanding. Durkheim, he invented the term. They had no clue how to measure it. So this is very new in sociological research. But from a historical sociological perspective, we probably have a lot of experiences where high levels of anomie has created an authoritarian society. One of these moments is probably the period between the First and Second World War. From a historical sociological point of view, we can see signs, when you read the text from this period, of high levels of anomie. And in Germany, it was played out as strong authoritarianism. This is the context of Hannah Arendt, Martin Heidegger, and other thinkers in Germany, in the background of a high level of anomie. Now, in this context, we have one of the figures is Carl Schmitt. Everyone heard about Carl Schmitt? Oh, you have, yeah. Carl Schmitt was a lawyer, a German lawyer. He operated in this precise time between the First and Second World War, and then moved on to the period of the Second World War. He believed that all values and ideas in politics come from theology. It's secularized theology. And he believed that without theology, these political ideologies would not be understandable. So what he coined was the idea of a political theology, which enlighten the politicians to see the deeper values in their political ideologies. For him, he considered himself as a theologian, but in service of politics. That's political theology for him. So he explained the political ideologies based on theology. And he inspired a lot of people. But one problem was that he joined the Nazi movement, so nobody dares to quote him, but in reality, they used his ideas. It's like Origen in the church history, using Origen, but not saying that this comes from Origen. Same Carl Schmitt. He influenced a generation of German thinkers, but without being quoted because of his Nazi alignment. One of the things that Carl Schmitt was convinced about was this idea that the Christian view was that the human being has fallen in sin, the fall. And therefore, it's impossible to establish a perfect society in this world. There will always be an enmity between friend and enemy in politics. That's why political parties exist and so on. But the problem with this view, from Carl Schmitt's perspective, is that you don't achieve anything. It's chaos all the time. You have a parliament, but nothing is done. So he was convinced that in order to transcend the negative things of the human fall, you need to have a strong sovereign, a leader that could make exceptions from the law, exceptions from the abstract norms in society. And therefore he hailed the rise of Adolf Hitler. And he said that with Hitler,
you mentioned Hitler here.
yeah. Mr. H. Now you have me again, yeah. So anyway, he hailed the rise of Adolf Hitler because he believed that we need a national sovereign that transcends enemy-friend dichotomy in politics. This way of understanding society, it's dependent on Carl Schmitt's understanding also of nomos, laws and norms. Carl Schmitt believed that nomos are the foundation of laws and norms, which is more important than laws. Laws, or what he called norms, in fact, is a bit of confusing here. But he believed that, the actual promulgated laws are always imperfect. So a national sovereign needs to be able to transcend and make exceptions to the law. This is now when we come close to the idea that he still believed in the perfect mediation between theory and practice. This was Carl Schmitt's idea. And the only way to mediate between them is to have a dictator. And he was very clear about this. In his book, The Dictator, he makes it very clear that there's a misconception about the concept of dictator. It doesn't need always to be negative. Sometimes we have to accept it as a necessary and even positive term. But his way of understanding this idea that political ideas are secularized theologies comes very close to what we experience now in this time when we can read about the Ruski Mir concept. This is exactly what Carl Schmitt would support and say, this is a transfer of a theology that has become secularized, which Carl Schmitt would say is a natural way of developing political ideologies. Martin Heidegger, he comes into this stage at the same time as Carl Schmitt. He's in the end of his, he is in the secularized theologies. There was a discussion about his spirituality. He's very spiritual, I have to agree with this, very spiritual. But he's in the end. It's when the theories has already been secularized. When theology has been secularized and become ideology. So he's in the end, while Carl Schmitt was following the procedure, how it was done, so to say. Heidegger believed intensively, like Carl Schmitt, that norms must be transcended by a sovereign. This created his support for Nazi Germany. In one of his pamphlets, he supports also the rise of a dictator. But he doesn't use the word dictator as Carl Schmitt did. And he had the same idea. To aspire perfection, that's a good thing, according to Heidegger. We will never reach it because we are fallen. But to aspire it is a necessity of humanity. And that's a sad journey that we are doing, that we know back of our minds that we can't reach perfection, but we are destined to aspire perfection. Heidegger influenced the entire Catholic line of thinkers who used his ideas. And in the same way, he was quoted by a lot of theologians and so on. He was not as tainted as Carl Schmitt was. But still, this idea of the aspiring of perfection became very important for these thinkers. When he then started to advocate the idea of the ontological difference, everyone knows ontological difference. Yeah. So the ontological difference for Heidegger is simply that being in itself is distinct from being in a world. Being in itself is not attainable for us directly. It's through being in a world that we attain being. This becomes extremely important for his understanding of a human being. Human being is not a being that is detached from others. No, being in the world, as human design, that is relational per se, because it takes place in time, and time creates relations. And this ontological difference has been the guiding force for many theologians and philosophers since then. So, by breaking with the idea of an isolated being, he also breaking with the egocentric understanding of the human being. Prior to Heidegger, the idea that Descartes introduced, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, that there's an essence in the human being, and where the individual is defined apart from its relation with time and with others, was finally philosophically broken through Heidegger. We can't understand the immense popularity that both Carl Schmitt and Heidegger had in Germany. They had a complete breakthrough and created a new wave of philosophies and thinking in Germany that prevailed even after the fall of Nazi Germany. But during this period, Carl Schmitt was hailed as the crown jewel of lawyers in Germany. And Heidegger was seen as a supreme ideologist for the future of Germany. In this situation, Hannah Arendt appears. Hannah Arendt had a short and brief relationship with Heidegger in 1925. But they had a lifelong philosophical relationship until in the second part of the 20th century. She broke with Heidegger when she joined a journey with Karl Jasper, and where Jasper probably said that you have to break with this guy. This guy is not good for you. There is an indication in a letter that she wrote to Jasper, which indicates that this is the reason why they broke, because it's clear that she broke with him and not the other. And also, he probably not had one relationship, Heidegger. She was not the only one. Probably had more relationships with women. He was 35 and she was 18. Then they had their brief relation. She was the interpreter of Heidegger. She made it actually Heidegger popular in his time. As a student, she made a lot of other students interested of Heidegger. Arendt was completely dependent on Heidegger. And he had this relationship with his students that created this dependency. They mirrored him. And he became very angry if the students could not break, if the students broke with him in their thoughts. So his students were very much attached to his ideas. That also is the case with Hannah Arendt. And she followed in his footsteps quite closely in the beginning for many years, interpreting his ideas, explaining Heidegger. And she was trapped in this argument that he's always returned to when they discussed. And you can read it in a briefwechsel, in the, how is it briefwechsel in English? Exchange of letters, yeah. So in the exchange of letters between Heidegger and Arendt, you can clearly see that he's always dominating the agenda. And for him, the main argument that he presents to Hannah Arendt is, how can you aspire perfection? How can you reach for progress if you can't mediate between theory and practice? This is the content of his dialogue. And she always responds, trying to defend herself against this idea, but always on the terms of Heidegger. Then suddenly, there is a break in their communication. I think it's 1957, or 55, I think it is. And during this period of silence between Heidegger, she breaks philosophically with Heidegger. And suddenly she turns everything around and says, I don't aspire perfection anymore. I don't need it. That's what she's trying to say to Heidegger. And he becomes furious. And he attacks her, and he openly becomes hostile against Arendt. And she writes to Jasper that it's an annoying element. He can't accept that I can count to 3, even 4. He wants me to be subordinate to him. I will no longer be subordinate to him. And she breaks this idea, and instead she says that no, this is not. It's a moment in life that is more important than the end. When she says it, when Arendt says this, she criticizes the precise idea of Heidegger that we are trapped in the moment of life where we are not free. It's only unto death that we are really free. Or in the end, when we can look back on our choices, that we are free. Therefore, we are destined always to search for our end in order to understand our present. And to achieve the perfect life, we can only do it from the end. This is Carl Schmitt, same idea as Carl Schmitt. It's the eschaton that Carl Schmitt tries to describe. It's only coming kingdom that we can be absolutely free, that we can actually achieve the perfect life. And this tragic drama is questioned by Arendt. She suddenly says, no, I renounce the position of the end defining the present. I will instead say simply that it's in the moment I start. I don't search for an end that will reconcile my present. And that's natality. And by rejecting that part, she also rejects to argue along the paradigm of Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger. This creates, for me and for many followers of Hannah Arendt, it creates a revolution in your mind. That you don't define yourself from an end. You don't define yourself from a perfection. You stand in the moment and you use the moment. There's no predefined ideas of perfection. It's an opportunity of life that opens up. But here comes also fear and practice into the perspective of Arendt. Because she knew, I need to solve this question of fear and practice. Because if I accept the mediation of theory and practice, I will not be able to argue with Heidegger. So therefore, she rejects the idea that I have to aspire the mediation of theory and practice. Now, we talked about gapability. I think it's a beautiful word, and we should explore this together. But Arendt, she does another thing. She turns theory and practice upside down. Heidegger is caught in this idea that theory precedes practice. That's why life has to move towards its end. The fulfillment of the ideas is in the end. While Arendt turns it upside down. She says simply that no, theory does not precede practice or action, that's her word. Instead, it's practice that precedes theory. And by doing that, it's a simple thing to do, but it's a revolution in the dialogue with Heidegger. Because it means that you don't follow his way of thinking anymore, and you break with that. Habermas, when he was sitting and working with his first article in 1957, it's parallel to Arendt. So he hadn't read anything, but he knew about Arendt. So it was in his mind. And then when he wrote his second piece of Theory and Practice, suddenly Arendt became very important for him. But he actually improved Arendt in many ways, because he moved towards understanding deeper the reversed idea of beginning and practice for theory, which then made Habermas write his most famous work, Theory of Communicative Action, which maybe some of you have heard, right? And the essence of this is from Arendt. The idea that I don't need to be defined from the future. But in theology, in Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, this prevailed. The eschatological agenda was totally dominant. And you still can hear, you can still hear people saying that the future comes towards us. This is Heidegger, this is Carl Schmitt, this is these theologians, that the future comes toward us, meaning that the end defines us in the present. And it's a beautiful thought, but it has a price. It requires the full mediation between theory and practice, and that requires a sovereign, a bishop, a patriarch, or something like that. It makes us trapped in the sad story that we'll never reach perfection in this life. We have to wait for it in the coming kingdom. And this was a theology that developed quickly and rapidly during the 20th century. And entrapped both Catholic and Orthodox theologians for half a century, I would say. And for Orthodox, it's still the ongoing paradigm. One of the major advocates in the Orthodox world for this idea that eschaton defines our present is John Cisiolas, which is famous in the Orthodox world. His entire theology is built on this idea. He goes so far to say that In this world, we are never free, because we are bound by necessity, and therefore never free. Only in the coming kingdom will we be free. And he adds, and maybe not even then, only God is really, really free. This perspective makes the story very sad. It takes away the moment of the present and makes us bound to the destined future, which we don't know. And the general paradigm has been that even if we would have a different idea, it would go against the church fathers. There's been a major argument in the Orthodox world and the Catholic world. But if we go back to Gregory the theologian, he talks about free earthquakes. Free earthquakes. Free earthquakes, yeah. Yeah. The first earthquake, Gregory says, is the law. Law makes us aware what is right and what is wrong. The second earthquake is, from his perspective, the gospel. The gospel says it's not enough that you do the law. You need to want to do the law. You need to want to do the law. And then he talks, this is normal, this is first the Torah, and then the Evangelion, but then he comes with the third earthquake, which often is neglected when people are studying Gregory the theologian. The third earthquake, he says, is that the future is here. And of course, Sociologist interprets it as the future comes towards us. But that's not what Gregory says. What Gregory says is that we don't need to be defined by the future. We can work in the present. This was revolutionary in the church. The Council of 325 was seen as an absolute council. Nothing could be added or changed. He needed to explain and introduce the third earthquake in order to the church fathers and the conciliar fathers to understand you have to take responsibility for the present. You cannot be defined by the previous council. You cannot be defined by future councils. You have to be in the present. Because the coming kingdom is already here. It's not an abstract entity in the future. It's here. The transformation of the world is going on in the church, not in the coming eschaton, in the church. And this was revolutionary because it made the church fathers and the conciliar fathers responsible for their decisions, which made them able to even change the creed from 325. If he wouldn't have said this, then everything would have broken apart in the church. And this is a complete different understanding of what it means by an eschatological thinking. To liberate people from the destined future is extremely important. And Arendt understood this. And that created a revolution of mind, which existed, I would argue, even previously. But during the 20th century, we're trapped in this idea that we are belonging to a sad story where our life will never be perfect and only in the future it will be a perfection. And Arendt said, in one of her lectures, she simply said, why should we accept this paradigm? Why should I enter into discussion with people based that I will never reach any kind of perfection? Why not just use the moment of the present and let's discuss? Let's take 1 minute break. Sit down on your chairs. Don't leave. Sit down and think about what I said. And then we will introduce a discussion concerning this.
Excuse me. What is the Ukrainian form of anomie?
Anomie.
Ukrainian form.
Anomie.
No. There is anomie and there are two responses.
Cynicism.
Cynicism. Why?
It means that you don't believe in anything. So it means that you question all authorities. So it's the opposite direction. So you question all authorities. It's quite interesting. I said that Ukrainians are very good at demonstrations, but not to change the political system. They're very good in, and then you have the demonstrations going on now. And this is actually a response in a high level of anomie, that you don't believe that you can change anything. So you just criticize, you just deconstruct. And this is cynicism. So you don't believe that you have the power in yourself to change anything. You can't change your church, so you criticize the church and say it's dysfunctional, but you don't dare to say that it could be changed. And the same with the political system. That's cynicism. While authoritarianism means that you need a strong leader, like Carl Schmitt is saying, you need Putin, you need a patriarch Kirill, you need someone who will take charge and save me. Because I can't save myself. I can't do anything. And local democracy becomes obliviated entirely in this society. So that's the Russian response and the Ukrainian response. First you ask questions, things that you want to be clear about. And then after the questions, you make comments. Ideas that has come up when I was speaking. And then, when we have these comments, then we will analyze it. What does it mean for you in your precise? You can criticize what I said, of course. But when you criticize, you still have to relate to what I said. Not move around to abstract discussion somewhere else. Still keep the focus on what I try to say, even if you make a critical direct response. But the first question is to clarify, so we are all on the same horizon, and then second part, to make comments, which pops up in your head, and then what does it mean for you in your way of, if you're it's one priest here, but what it means in your life as philosophers, theologians, or thinkers. So please, first questions.
I have a question. What does it mean to transcend norms? Just what that norms must be transcended. You mentioned that. What does it mean?
The precise thing with Carl Schmitt is that norms are what we would like to say regulations. But when I use norms normally, I use it as a more a foundational meaning. But for him, nomos is the foundation. So that's why it's a little bit confusing with Carl Schmitt, that norms are the regulations that leads to laws. So transcending norms means that you reach the foundations, the nomos. So the real foundation of a moral society cannot be encapsulated in regulations in a society. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you need a sovereign who can make exceptions for the real foundation of nomos. Understandable?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you said that Arendt is proposing another, or non-eschatology, in a way, opposing to Schmitt's dependence on the end, and Schmitt and Heidegger. But by that, does she mean a kind of present kingdom, so we can reach perfection, we can build heaven on earth, and whatnot? Or she is kind of agnostic and she just proposes not to think in terms of the end, while also not supposing that we can reach the ideal? Or could you explain maybe more what this opposing stance in terms of natality, I think, means in how we relate to action, for example, and this perfection aspect?
first of all, she made her thesis on Augustine, and she interpreted Christianity from two perspectives: Augustine, and then secondly, the interperiod between the two world wars. That's her understanding of Christianity, and also through what she encountered in the philosophical debates in her time. And one of the things that were extremely accentuated in this time was the idea that human being was fallen, but the human being would be redeemed in the coming kingdom. And she hated that. And she hated Christianity for that. She thought that Christianity was the real reason why humanity was so entrapped in a totalitarianism. So she had a kind of philosophical agnosticism, I would say. She wanted to get rid of this idea of, that you're defined by the end.
Original sin.
Yeah, original sin and everything. This is, for her, it was more or less rubbish, if I would be honest. Instead, she said very clearly that the very question of perfection is wrong. The question should be addressed, how do you live your life? Now, there are norms in life when it comes, but why ask that question? Why aspire the idea that, the ultimate end, like Heidegger? Just forget it, If you forget it, we will be so much more happier. And one has to understand also that if you think about a depressed person entering into a room, analyzes all social relations in the room. That's a sign of a depression. So if you do it, you're a little bit depressed probably. Because that's what we do. We try to take control when they're depressed. We can't take control of our own emotions, so we try to control the rest. A happy being is filled with emotions inside you. If you're in love, for example, you're filled with emotions and you don't analyze the rest of it because you're so happy with yourself. This is very much the relationship between Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. Arendt was a happy person. She became more depressed with Heidegger. But she was a happy person when she was 18 years old, and Heidegger was a very depressed person. She was filled with the opportunities of life and the possibilities of life, while Heidegger was occupied with analyzing everyone else except himself. And she accuses him of this. You hate yourself, that's why you do it. That's what she is accusing me for. So she thinks that the very question of going from your own happiness to the sad, miserable condition of life, that's a mistake. Stay with your happiness. Stay with your natality.
Чи правильно зрозумів я вас, що ви протиставляєте погляди Ханни Аренд із поглядами митрополита Зізіуласа?
Did I understand you right that you're putting in opposition the thought of Hannah Arendt and the thought of Zizulus?
Absolutely. Zizulus is the most extreme case of an escapist from reality. He had no experience as a bishop in real life. He developed a theology which created an idea of eschatology defining everything in life. He even come up with the idea that you need a sovereign in the church, and a monarch, the ecumenical patriarch in this case, who defined the rest of the bishops. People have read Zizulus in a completely different way from me, and Aristotle Papanikolaou has been an advocate for a more humane understanding of Zizulus, and you have the Serbian Orthodox Church has been preoccupied through Ignatius Midic and others, but in reality, he is an absolute example of the opposite of Hannah Arendt. Yes.
No comments, only questions now?
And then later on, we'll, yeah, you can come.
So, do I understand right? So, if Heidegger is talking about perfect goal, then every human is just an instrument to this goal. It's like a bricks. So it's also lead to some sort of thinking about people like instruments. They're just like bricks or just fuel for a German machine.
You mean you mean
Heidegger?
Heidegger or
Yeah, not
Heidegger? No, I don't think he would say that. He would say rather that no, it's a human being that is the focus and the goal for Heidegger, and the ontological difference is defense for the freedom of a human being. But he draws a conclusion that the human being is never really free, but she is at least free to aspire freedom. You know, that is connected with this idea of fullness, of perfection. The only thing is that he defines the current situation as incomplete and can only be complete in the end. So it's like, you know, when you're just before death, you can look back to your life, and then you can become aware of your choices, and that's Heidegger.
You said you think there has been anomic societies for a long time, but only now we know how to measure it. How do we measure it now?
And that's a complicated question, but to make it very shortly, Anomie in Durkheim's understanding had certain criteria. We have abandoned that. We believe that it's a lot of different criteria we have to look at. Therefore, some scholars have abandoned the idea of anomie, and they instead look at certain characteristics in society that they measure. So political scientists, for example, they look at certain precise things that indicates that we have a problem in society. Some scholars would abandon the idea of anomie because it's too imprecise. But still, it's useful in pedagogical situations like this. But when we look at society of anomie, we don't talk about anomie per se. We talk about things that are connected to anomie. And exactly, aggression among youths, for example. And when these signs are very clear, then we indicate that there is a future that will be quite destructive. One of the sad things is that when a society reaches a certain level of anomie, it cannot change on its own anymore. It means that it needs the external help of other countries or something else. And Ukraine and Russia has passed that, so it's too high.
What
What?
is about European? What is about European?
European anomie. What about
Which type of anomie is in Europe today?
No, we have in Europe today, we have high levels of anomie. High levels. It's nothing comes close to Ukraine and Russia in Europe, so that's the highest. But and Russia is absolutely that's the highest that we have measured in since we started with this. Nothing has been able to compete with Russia. But there are also high levels in certain parts of Europe. And these levels often create populism. They are voting for personalities. And populism can be good for a society if it's the level is between certain levels. That's what we have identified. So if it's not too low and not too high, populism can actually increase the sense of meaningfulness. If it's too low, then it becomes counterproductive, and if it's too high, it becomes counterproductive. But we still need more research on this, and this is just in the beginning at the moment.
But this war is enemy. This war, Russian-Ukrainian war, is European enemy. My favorite day in this year, 25 years, the 25th year, was 10th of May, when all leaders of Europe went to Kiev and for a pending of very strong action. They formulated ultimatum for Putin. If Putin will not agree with ultimatum, they destroyed Russia after 2 days. And it was not populist position. It was position of all leaders of Europe. in one day, 10th of May. And decisive day for Putin was 12th May. And they forgot about their ultimatum after 2 days. What does it mean in these enemy watches? So we have no responsibility at all, not in populist level, on European high level of politics.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a different thing than talking about anomie in this case. It's Carl Schmitt would say this is an example where you need a sovereign, a sovereign who can actually implement an idea. Democracy has one flaw, and that's you have a risk that a leader can say something, but it will not become a reality. And European Union countries, they are in this democracy entrapment. But we haven't found a solution to going for Carl Schmitt's idea, having a sovereign. We know that's not a good solution. The best way, that's Habermas thinking, that you need to make a distinction between executive power and political power, as he used it. But his idea was quite naive, if I will be honest. I don't fancy Habermas' political view. Anyway, if it's more questions, otherwise you go to comments.
I have a question.
Let me see. We take it in this order, so we go in circle. So first you.
Comment. I was wondering how.
It's a comment or question?
Comment.
Then wait.
Oh, okay.
Julia?
My question is continuation of the question about transcending the norms. How do you see the mechanism how a person is being able to transcend the conventional norms within the society? What is the mechanism, and can we cultivate this capacity of transcending the norms and creating new norms?
Since I have discussed with you before, now anarchism and Carl Schmitt, they meet each other because Carl Schmitt he argued simply that any authority that is built on parliamentarianism is an imperfect authority and it belongs to the fallen world. So it can oppress people heavily. Therefore you need a sovereign. Anarchism skips the sovereign and the society in parliamentarianism also. But the same thing, the idea is that something is rotten in this world, as Darfur Chalter wrote in one of his chapters. Something is rotten in this world. So the question of Carl Schmitt, for example, transcendence of norms, it's not how you can transcend norms in a way that how would I say it? Carl Schmitt would argue, if he would sit here, without a sovereign, when they are bound by this imperfection, if you really want to go to the deep levels of foundation of norms, the nomos, then we need a power that can make exceptions to the norms, to reveal the real essence. And Carl Schmitt argued then that we need a dictator. And he said it bluntly, we need a dictator for this. And so transcendence here is connected with a particular Carl Schmitt idea.
Yeah, but my question is a bit different because, like, my question is, like, we do have conventional norms. For example, when we take the Ukrainian society, so we do have social norms and rules and laws that are feeding the state of anomie, for example. So to change the state of anomie, we do need to have new norms as a culture.
Can wait with that, because that's more a comment than a question, so wait with it.
Yeah. I have two questions. One concerns the patristics and another the contemporary theology. You said that only Gregory the theologian kind of...
Not only.
Yeah,
I said I used example of
Gregory.
Gregory.
The only one who is speaking of the earthquakes. Yeah, this.
No.
And another one, because I didn't finish your chapter and only read a little bit, how does Schmitt fit into this eschatological
Okay. Let's save it also for the comments, because that's going beyond what I've said, but I will comment upon that later, if you keep it in mind. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes.
The question is, so you speak about a separation between between an ideal theory of the eschaton and the practice of today somehow, and I wonder how this separation connects to salvation's history and human history, because if I understand it right, Karl Löwit also tries to kind of overcome Heidegger, but directly by the opposite, by separating the eschaton or the salvation history as something which is not connected to our human action and our. So how does those two things relate to each other?
Let me see now.
Because it sounds like the opposite, even though both try to overcome Heidegger.
Yeah. If now we stay with Hannah Arendt, that's otherwise we move away from it. But Hannah Arendt is the thing is here is that you just give up the aspiration of mediating first between theory and practice. Secondly, that you don't let the end define the present. So that's it. And when you give this up, you need to have an alternative. And her alternative is to reverse practice and theory. We start in life, we start in the moment of the present, and reflect on our life. It's like theologians reflecting on spiritual experience. When we compare this with other thinkers, the same effort has been done in trying to do the same thing, but there's a reign of people that has tried to do it. But Arendt was not discovered, I would say, in the full sense. So before Habermas and others began to read Arendt, she was not considered serious, partly because she was a woman, if I'm honest. So, but I think that Arendt is a primary source for doing this. That's my only. You can then comment upon it later on. Now, that's the last question, because we are stuck in questions.
I don't want to get stuck in the concept of anomie, because I understand it's more complex than we can explain here. But how can we prove that in European countries, like say Sweden, that it's not an anomic society, that the people, that the leaders don't rise due to populism, even if they have also very more liberal ways of thinking, if that youth can actually name the things that they are saying, that like in light of like the racism, of like how they treat indigenous people, how like the secularism and individualism, it's like the country with the most single households. Like how can we say that the youth being less violent isn't just what they learned, but it's actually because like they have an inner meaning and they want to act like not enormously. Like I don't understand why you have so much certainty that like Russia and Ukraine have super high levels of this. Also in light of that that people are still there's a lot of apathy towards conflicts that are very nearby. Like there's a lot of othering, like looking at the others as not deserving the same as you.
The trust in representative governance is a basic thing in countries with low levels of anomie. So it simply means that you have a basic trust in the system. When it's high levels of anomie, you don't have a trust in the system. And in Sweden, there is a high trust in the system. Believe me, that's every poll shows that. It doesn't mean that there are not discrimination, because that's a different thing. Even countries with low level of anomie can be discriminating. That's a different thing. But when you don't have trust in the system, then it's high levels of anomie. There is a direct connection with not with poverty, because you can be a poor country and have high level. And you have, if it's a country that has been in the same level, it's often high levels on me is coming with increased expectations of prosperity. Like the fall of the Soviet Union created the idea that we will develop now, and then the unfulfilled development is probably one of the reasons of high levels of anomie. but we still need more research. But the lack of trust in the system, that's what is connected with the Anomie. Now comments.
We had the discussion, as you remember, at lunch 2 days ago about law, the nature of law. And I think it is useful to put it here in the rules as well, because for me there's a problem. I really enjoy that you put Carl Schmitt here out in the open, and as I said also at the very beginning when we met as a group, and I think Anastasia, you presented we had these entry points to Arendt and to like kind of collective action, and I said there might be a difference between the collective we and the I, like kind of how individual subjectivity functions and how collective subjectivity functions. And for me there's a problem with the idea of creating laws together, creating norms together as a group, as a collective entity, which perhaps never can never stop to arrive at such a notion as Schmitt's sovereign. That, for example, what we did when we met here, the first thing that we did was, let's create some rules. Let's come together, let's go to a flip chart, and let's say what we want to do. We created rule, don't be late, don't do this, don't do that. We acted as a sovereign. We were like, this is what we agree on. But what happens? We break the rules constantly. We are late, we go to the toilet, we do this and that. And that's good, that's normal, that's how life functions. But we are not a sovereign. The sovereign doesn't exist. It's an illusion. And I wonder, how can we come to the idea of creating law, of doing law, of abiding to a law that does not come from a sovereign? Because this sovereign idea is bullshit. There is no sovereign. God, perhaps. But how does God disclose him or herself to us? Not through an assembly in which we say, this is our rule. So it's like, this is my problem. How can we think beyond Schmitt?
Someone has been thinking about this. Could you respond to him?
Just need one policeman here. And it will be okay, everything.
Nice.
No, it's a joke, but it's an answer who look for the order and every time say to you that you are having stay in order.
But it
And then we make change our behavior.
But it is a question for me. Can we create such space by our web of relationship that we don't need a policeman?
No, we need a moderator. What's the moderator? But we need a moderator. No, something like this. And another way, another answer is that there are no, everybody see the rules. I don't see the rule because I missed the first day. I born in 1922, no, a joke. And your rule makes in 1900, and I don't make this rule with you. And I have to know these rules, and I don't see these rules. No. Okay.
It's a good experiment that shows that
I'm sorry,
it's
can
not
I
a point.
Yeah.
follow up on this?
Yeah.
Because this is precisely the classic argument against social contract theory. You have a kid. Okay, we agree here, social contract. But you have a kid. Has the kid agreed, signed the social contract? No. The kid just goes doing things. That's how we work. And so the idea that we sign up for something, I haven't signed up by being born. So it's like, how do we get out of this idea that law can only come from a law-giving activity? We have not given the law to the child. The child adheres to something. But where does that come from? So this is what I'm really struggling with, because as long as we think of a law as only coming from a law-giving entity, we will be stuck with this idea that the sovereign has to create a rule, and that you only adhere to the law by adhering to the rule. And I want to think beyond that. This is really important to me.
I think we have to create
who does it?
When we have collapse with religion, politics.
But we already do have collapse of
Yes,
everything.
we will
Nothing
die.
has
We will
changed.
die, and our children will make new society.
How?
Reading the books. No, it's true, but in the practice, I think we have a society of the power and sovereign, and we have made society on the contract. It's contracting, and when child is born, he have some rules, and then child go to contract. Child go to contract in this situation. And we are living in a world where some people make rules for us, and we can contract. But we live in the world of business. World of business is contracting world, and it's okay. It's no problem.
Marie, you had a comment?
Not on this. Maybe.
No, but I think we're now in a new turn. So.
Okay, if I understand it right, that then this connection of our action, or the making it equal, making our action equal with the story of salvation, is also considered for many thinkers a super dangerous utopian vision, and so kind of distinguishing the eschaton, putting it into the off of the future, was actually trying to escape this utopian totalitarian vision of what we do now and what we can do now is already the human salvation. And so first of all, is there kind of is Hannah Arendt kind of a theologian way out, or can Hannah Arendt at all be seen as a theological way out of this problem that you described before, or is there kind of another theological way, or does the theological way out kind of contradict what Hannah Arendt does? So it's a little bit mixed up, but yeah.
Someone who wants to make a comment on this?
I want to differentiate between theological and spiritual. I think it's also maybe a question of if you approach it like from a theological, it's maybe correlated to an nomos in this section. Spiritual is also a way of how you act on something. I think this is a practice. So this is a theory practice kind of interrelation, or maybe how to differ that. And maybe.
But it uses the same words in the end. So this vision of an eschaton which is unreachable is used in the other vocabulary as a solution to free ourselves of the totalitarian vision of making salvation equal to our human action in history. Yeah. You have to speak louder, or take the microphone.
This idea of immanent and what's more important, complete eschatology in present, I think really in this direction with Masha, can lead to formulation of, for example, complete creedal formulas, which is grounded in complete eschatological reality, or even, institutions which think about themselves as grounded in complete immanent eschatology. And so I think that there is real threat of the lack of distance between our actions and goal, horizon, final end of our actions, eschaton in general. So I think there is real totalitarian effects, risks in this immanentization of eschatology.
Now, no one comments on directly, but Father Petra, you had a comment?
Продовження здійснення есхатології в Зізіоласа якраз і є оця логіка, що богослів'я, перш за все, це практика. Спочатку є життя спільноти, в якому народжується теорія. Тобто є спочатку практичне життя, все його богослів'я до цього зведено, тому я не зовсім розумію, чому це протиставляється її погляду.
So I don't really understand why they're acute in opposition, because Ziziolas has this beginning in practice, because community life as a practice is the beginning of creation of a theory.
І коли я в своєму короткому виступі говорив про, що все відбулося і живи цим, тут мені, наприклад, це дуже нагадує її позицію, тобто Богом майбутнє вже може бути тут присутнє, в тому, як ми один до одного ставимося. Зі Зіоласа це постійно звучить, ця фраза «брати і сестри», тобто ми стаємо співвідповідальні один за одного.
And when I was preparing my talk, was like the salvation already happened, now you have to live it. So this future is already happening in relations between us when we live this community life of happening salvation.
І в нього взагалі зустрічаються думки, які співпадають із літургією, що ми згадуємо страшний суд. Тобто, що страшний суд згадуємо, він вже відбувся.
And he also has sentences which are coincide with the liturgy, that we are remembering the final trial.
Last judgment.
Last judgment, thanks. The last judgment. So we are remembering, so it's kind of already happening.
І я б сказав так, я достатньо багато читав з Езіолоса, але про Ханну Арендт знав дуже мало до цієї школи. І в мене виникає питання, чому в мене немає зовсім протиставлення до її поглядів, якщо для мене важливі погляди з Езіолоса.
So I was reading Zizoulas a lot, but didn't know much about Hannah Arendt before the school. So my question is actually, why did no contradiction arise in what I was thinking close to Zizoulas and what I heard about Hannah Arendt so far?
І останнє, такий невеличкий коментар, є цікавий момент у сирійському богослів'ї, в сирійських містиків. Вже давно була, ще там, 2-3 століття, 3-4 століття, думка про те, що гріхопадіння не було.
And another question also, the Syriac mystics, they had a thought in the 3rd and 4th century that the fall of man did not take place.
Тобто загалом і в християнстві були спроби створювати трошки інший наратив цього руху розвитку людини.
So also Christianity had attempts of creating different narratives of human movement.
Someone's comment on this?
As for me, it's discussion between Plato and Aristotle, as I understand. And some part of us say this Plato is good, and some part of us say this Aristotle is good. And between this gap, and we try and find capability person. What is this in the tradition of philosophy? There's a capability between Plato and Aristotle. Because as for me, if we go from the route, from society, and take, I don't know, ideological, or what are you talking about? It's very hard, as we see in Ukraine, as far as we have some ideas that can transform society in Ukraine. And this places, it's a theology and philosophy for me. And then they put in the society, and then society try to change. Of course, it's not idealistic translating of these ideas. And then you have to be in real life and change these ideas. And for me, it's like transcending from the culture in what we live, because we don't like to live in culture in what we are now in Ukraine. And I think we have collapsed this practice of creating ideas for transcending with theology or religion and with philosophy, or maybe some practice more. And it's a problem of the world, this for me, Western world, maybe in Eastern world it's not a problem. And I think we have to answer these questions, how to change. And I think we have a lot of problems with religion, we have a lot of problems with philosophy and philosophy, and I think we have a lot of problems with arts, which can make ideas transforming the same. And it's very interesting how to. And I don't believe that we can take from the society ideas for transforming society. In the mass, it's be like just people who want to eat, dance, other things.
But that Hannah Arendt, like in opposing of transcending the norms of society to transform society, Hannah Arendt would not say, no, you have to stay in society, but Hannah Arendt would say, the as being born as something new. So from the beginning, transcend society, but not from the end, not from a higher idea, but by being born and carrying in them this newness of their birth, they are already a transcendence. So when the people who are being born enter society, they transform it just of what they are and just of the newness that they bring. So it's not like transforming from within, it's still a newness which comes.
But the problem is that we are not doing it. So like we do have this potentiality of natality within us, but like we do have a deconstructed world, and the world that gives us more suffering and pain and oppression than happiness. So like the question is, yes, like we do have this potentiality to renew like to make the world new. And Hannah Arendt, when she's talking about education, so like the quote is that like education is to answer the question, do we love our children enough to make the space for them to like for renewal of the world.
Last comment, then go to it.
Hannah Arendt would have liked what happened on the Euromaidan. And I sometimes see this elevated feeling people had who participated in this. Seems kind of similar to what she's describing in this theory of action. That means when you act and when you are brave, when you interact, that it elevates your existence in a way, and you are more attentive, you see more, and you are just, you have an other state of being in this very moment. And I think she would have appreciated these processes very much. And when the connection to theology, I know that there were a lot of representatives of religious communities during the Euromaidan present there. And
recent 2014,
2014.
there were Christian peasants, priests, liturgies were on the Maidan. They had the church in the tent, and different confessions as well.
And the interesting process was what I've heard, that there was like a transfer of values, actually for values and from experience, actually from the Euromaidan and from the commitment and the responsibility into the religious realm. That there was some kind of process happening in this direction. And I think this is a quite interesting moment, so that that like the creation of values or experience, etc., doesn't go down, but it like from the top down, but the other way around in this context. And I think this is an interesting moment.
Brief comment on that.
Yeah.
We can say that there was the sense of presence, which in a way that Kuzansky would have said that probably kind of resolves the contradictions. That sense of presence, which resolves the contradictions. That how we can in a way describe this the spirit of Maidan, if you talk about that.
I think it was connected with the feeling of solidarity. And I don't know, love in a sense, in a collective way that you would not usually experience or trust.
Sure, we were talking with Max later yesterday evening, and that I could say that was that plurality, if you want, the multitude of newnessness.
Okay, then the last comment here.
The third last.
Yeah.
We speak about difference in some sense, and there is difference for Hannah Arendt between actor and another form of also human condition lies in the field that not all people are voices of democracy, but actors. And main question is what is the process of generating of actors? Each human being has two possibilities: to be a wonderful animal or immortal being with ability to act. And for me, main problem is not, of course, in the relation between theory and practice, but this is question for actor, not for all people. And this is, I think that it's decisive moment how we hope to receive actor or all condition, all realization of human condition. And if we have only labor and work, it's not for human. And the problem is that we have super hope that all people want to be actors. And this is the problem, because we want to speak with all people as actors, but they are not actors. It's population in many, many situations. And for me, it's most interesting question, how we can meet actor. And this lack of action is problem of Hannah Arendt.
But also Carl Schmitt. Yes, it's like Carl Schmitt's problem, because he says there is no enough actors, but we need one, at least one. And this is sovereign.
Yes,
the sovereign is the actor.
But without actors, all this conversation about practices of democracies and so on, it's dialogue between anomic animals who want to do something, to eat, to sleep, to something like that. It's not human condition. And problem in this crisis of actorship. And in this sense, we receive this all this position, how we want to begin this process of generation of actors. Version of Heidegger. For me, Arendt is a very strong thinker because he began the theme of natality. Natality in each action. And this is fantastic, but Heidegger was not so simple guy, because he was genius for beginning. All his lectures was focus for all listeners, because he began each time new lecture. He never read two lectures. And it was art of beginning. And I think that for Hannah Arendt he was so magnetic, because he had this ability for initiate process of thinking, not for his theory, but for his practice.
We don't have more comments now, but just to say three things when I listen to you. First, you had a question of liturgical theology, since that's my expertise of connecting this. I do appreciate Jon Sisiola's understanding of ecclesial being. I do appreciate his way of talking about being as communion. I think this is a very important contributions by Sisiolas. But he doesn't have a baptismal ecclesiology. Baptismal. Which is criticized by John Erickson and others, which means simply he doesn't have a theology for the present. He doesn't have this understanding that the gift of the Holy Spirit is a gift for being in the present. It's a gift of remembering the future, but we're remembering what? While the idea of a baptismal ecclesiology is simply that we receive the gift of the Spirit to be able to be in the present, to be assisted in fulfilling our dreams and expectations and our communication and so on. And this is what John Erickson, the previous dean of St. Vlad's in America, criticized Sisiolas for, which is a completely righteous critique. And the second thing which is problematic with Sisiolas is founding his idea of ecclesial being in the perfection of God. Therefore, the only perfect ecclesial being is in the common kingdom. And therefore, he defines everything else as related to the fall of man. By moving ecclesial being into, instead of moving it from the perfection of God and using Hannah Arendt, we can move ecclesial being to our relations through baptism. So that's my suggestion of improving Sisiulas. And liturgical theology is Alexander Schmitt that you mentioned. He was trapped in this idea that the liturgy was the kingdom. So he said to his students, let's go to the kingdom, meaning to the liturgy. And he believed that everything was contained in liturgy. There is a liturgy after the liturgy. There is a life of a church after the liturgy, where people like laity, women and others are involved in. If you reduce the church just to the service of a liturgy, it becomes a dysfunctional reality. And this is what we experience now in the Orthodox world. We experience a church that has been reduced, reified, if you use the term, to the liturgy. With no solutions for a dysfunctional hierarchy. You know, we have bishops that doesn't function, but we have no solution on how to handle it. Because we can't even talk about it anymore. The second thing is anomie. Hannah Arendt didn't know so much about anomie. She would actually be very inspired by this Euromaidan. And Euromaidan is in itself, of course, a very positive thing. That's what created the independence of Ukraine and so on. But it needs a sequel, like the liturgy after the liturgy. It needs a continuation. It needs changed political structures. And that's what I fear in Ukraine, that it doesn't lead to changed structures. It stops because nobody wants to be a politician, because it's a bad thing. You know, if you're a politician, you're corrupted, even before you start, right? We need to have a more positive approach towards politicians if you want to have elections in a country like Ukraine. So that's my small point. Now, the last, don't have time, so just to finish this up, to say, if you think about this, those of you that did not know about the distinction between theory and practice and this gapability, has it changed your way of thinking? Those of you have not known beforehand or haven't reflected on it, the importance of being in the present. Then, will it change your way of thinking? That's my question. If you knew it before, but maybe you now believe it's more important. So that's my question. Are there any transformative effects here in this group?
Thank you.
I think it strengthened my antipathy to what you call absolute enlightenment. This idea that, as I already said, I'm repeating myself here, there has to be a mediation from a good idea to a good ideal practice, mediated through contract or mediated through an ideal about who we want to be or through a sovereign or so on. I knew that I was against that anyways, but it just, like, the discussion and what your emphasis just showed to me, like, just how dangerous this idea of perfection is. And say more on that subject.
Lydia?
On the one hand, yes, it did help me feel better with my desire for practice being fully validated, at least in the church. Well, in the church it's kind of not, because there is so much of eschatology. On the other hand, when you put it so radically and so kind of condensed today, kind of against eschatology, something in me, switched to the other thing, and I was thinking about the same thing that Danilo says about the total kind of immanunciation, whether it cannot also become totalitarian. I mean, if you start kind of deriving everything out of practice.
Someone else?
Yeah, so to me, as I coined in one of the talks outside the classroom, that I studied badly, but in the good places and with good people. So now, what I'm hearing from you is kind of starting to make sense to things I already knew through conversations, to just practice understandings. And yes, I never read Arendt. I never heard of her theory of action, how she puts it, and since me coming from the theater world in a way, and they also talk about action and acting, and me now having Arendt along the lines, and basically I just got the logical entrance point to talk about those kind of realities and experiences, but within the political realm of society in a way. So that's connected, and also what you told about Anomie and about diagnosis of societies, nations, that was very important. But also what's important that you mentioned that there are levels of anomie from within which the nation itself can't truly help itself. It loses any kind of connection to the world, to the reality. That just becomes the delusional group of people, and that's also very important to me. And even I hear it here in the book. For example, Yulia asks that basically, but she asks that from within the Ukrainian society. Well, how we can do that? How we can transcend our norms? Like how we, and I basically hear that we can't help ourselves. I hear it from our questions that we still think of a savior or something. I mean, I hear that we are Ukrainians and we have problems, and that understanding that even in this room, like with intellectuals, we are still that, because you can have that feel that well, I mean, Ukrainians are somewhere there, the population is there, but we here kind of know things. Yet we are more deeply Ukrainians that we can think of, and I think that thought is very important to kind of not exclude yourself as, well, we are the sovereigns or something, and to include and therefore share the problem and share the reality, actually, not being an escapist in an intellectual realm, because we can't help that ourselves. Okay.
Well, what I've got from the transformation here on this course, like I have read Arendt before, but maybe like different works, so I've been reading it more now. And today I really loved your comparison with the Maiden and everything. And I also really like the reference to Heidegger. And now I see the whole picture all together, because I understood why we less learned Arendt in the university and more Heidegger, because Heidegger was practical. And as for me, like Hannah Arendt is like rather naive, because if we talk even about the action, it's like the politics for her is rather a performance, but not a plan. It's not a strategy. It's not like something that we can actually use. And like as well as a labor is something that's like more practical, and like she rather creates an idea of like perfect policy and whatever, as well as we are trying to create something in talking but not in doing. So like as for me, doing and having a plan is more transformative rather than what is like shown by Hannah Arendt, because we stuck it, like we will come to the end of the same like trouble as for me.
We end there just to say I do believe in eschatology, but as Natality. Just the end question. So.
I have a small commentary on capability. Maybe it's a funny one, because when some of my plans are falling apart and my theories about my future or about relationship with other people are ruined, I call my granny, and she always responds Ukrainian phrase "Думка з ділом ніколи не сходиться." Thought can never meet with I don't know, act. So it reminds me about this capability all the time.
The words is yours now.
Yeah, we do have 20 minutes break, and we'll start the class with